I'm Colleen Moore, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Education Insight Center at Sacramento State.
Well, you heard our discussion, so.
I did, yes.
Who wants to go first?
Oh, that's me? I assumed you would go first.
Okay.
You're in the agenda first.
Okay, yes, good afternoon, and thank you, Chair Roth and other members for the opportunity to speak today. As I said, I'm Colleen Moore at the Education Insight Center, and I was asked to give comments today based on some research I did over a couple of years on California's approach to tracking student progress across K-12 and higher ed and its needs going forward. I think I gave a summary document. You don't have to reference it while I'm talking, but just...
I read the one that was in my package.
Oh, okay,
for both
great.
of you, actually. So, and when in doing your remarks, maybe you could touch on some of the issues that the prior
Yes,
panelists.
I will try to do that. I think I have some prepared remarks that I think address some of your questions, but I did make myself notes about like places to divert to answer things that you asked. So anyway, I did research over a couple of years, and I'd like to start with the positive aspects of what I found. So while there is no statewide cross-sector data system in California, the 4 public education systems each have longitudinal student data systems that are quite good, as you heard them talk about. Includes CalPAD's system at CDE, and each of the higher ed segments also has a longitudinal student data system. So these systems contain information that's very valuable for understanding student progress and outcome within each system. So the information are generally updated annually in some cases, or at specified points during each term in other cases, depending on what the data is. And they have some information that's matched to other state agencies. So CSAC gives the higher ed segments, some financial aid related data. They get matches to EDD data, as you also heard talk about. So these data are primarily used for state and federal reporting requirements. But in recent years, each system office has increased its efforts to make more information available through online data dashboards and other reports. You heard them mention a couple of things, the Salary Surfer and UC's Info Center. They sometimes share student data among themselves to address particular needs, as you heard them describe. So what's wrong with having 4 good longitudinal data systems, but no cross-sector data system? So I'll point to 3 issues. First, the information we have about student progress and outcomes is disconnected. While there is some data sharing at the system level, as I noted, and there are some voluntary data sharing efforts across institutions in some regions, we have no way to get a comprehensive statewide picture of the education to workforce pipeline in California. So from a budget and policy perspective, what this does is reinforces California's very siloed approach to education planning. Second issue is that the information is largely inaccessible. While I did mention that each system provides some good information, it's often compliance focused or framed in ways that suit the needs and interests of the systems themselves. Similar information is often calculated and presented very differently across the systems, making it difficult for policymakers, educators, students, and the public to interpret it. A third issue is inefficiency. The current approach has a number of inefficiencies built into it, and one of them kind of came up on the last panel. So as one example, we have multiple agencies and individual institutions that contract with the National Student Clearinghouse just in an effort to try and figure out what happens to their students when they leave. So this is surely a boon for the Student Clearinghouse, but it's a real failure to leverage state resources. So having good information that's disconnected and inaccessible with inefficient means of putting the pieces together, what that means is it leaves us unable to answer critical questions about student progress and outcomes across systems. And it makes it impossible to develop evidence-based policies and practices that will best serve students as they move through multiple systems. So you asked about some specific examples of questions. In one of my reports, I had a list of just examples of critical questions we can't now answer. So I'll give you a couple that are particularly policy focused, just as examples. So what are the outcomes of CSU and UC teacher candidates? And what is their readiness and rate of retention when they become employed by the state's K-12 schools? That's an issue you might be able to address with a longitudinal data system if you included information also from the Teacher Credentialing Commission. What happens to eligible students who meet eligibility requirements for CSU and UC, but they're not admitted due to capacity constraints? Where do they go? Do they go to college? Where do they go? Are districts that
Now, we
receive...
would have a problem there, right, because someone testified in the K through 12 system, they don't capture Social Security numbers in K through 12. So in trying to figure out where they go and what they do, we have a problem, right?
At the moment, we do, but you could look and see if the students who were, say, denied admission, even though they met eligibility requirements, they have already provided their Social Security number as part of having applied. So you would have it, so that you could then look and see, did they go to a community college?
I see.
With a match to the clearinghouse? Did they go out of state? With a match to EDD, did they end up going straight to work and didn't go to college at all? So those are kinds of things you could figure out, like what happened? What are the consequences of our capacity constraints in the CSU and UC systems on actual students?
I see.
So, just as one more example, are districts that receive extra funding through the local control funding formula increasing the proportion of their students who enroll in college ready to succeed? We've implemented a lot of big state initiatives and policies in recent years with very little ability to analyze how effective they are. So those are just a few examples of questions, that you might be interested in that a longitudinal data system could address. As to the challenges we face in developing a data system, my research suggests that they're largely political and cultural. The fact that California is coming rather late to the party in terms of developing a statewide data system is actually helpful in regard to technical challenges. Most other states have or are in the process of developing such data systems, which gives us plenty of examples to learn from, as Pam Brown mentioned earlier. These states have already faced issues like matching records when K-12 and post-secondary have different student IDs, or figuring out mechanisms to maintain data privacy and security. There are plenty of reports to read and experts to consult to understand and apply the lessons from those states to our own context. The bigger challenges are in deciding what basic type of data system to develop and identifying appropriate leadership for the effort. So do we pursue a traditional statewide longitudinal data system that involves connecting the records across these 4 systems that we already have? This is the approach used in other states, and it has the advantages of leveraging California's considerable existing investments and requiring a fairly short timeline to develop at a more reasonable cost. Some argue that instead, California should try to develop a data system that involves more frequent uploads of information that would come from individual schools and colleges, but one that could be used to provide services to individual students as they transition across institutions. I believe Christian referred to that as making sure we're serving local practitioner lens in a data system. So while there are promising local and regional examples of such systems, there are significant concerns in considering them as the model for the initial development of a statewide system in terms of larger technical barriers, greater costs, and an extensive time frame before comprehensive statewide data might be available. So if California decided to pursue, at least as an initial approach, a more traditional statewide data system, the primary challenge would seem to involve deciding on a governance structure. Other states use a variety of approaches. My research ended up concluding that California might best be served by establishing a state data agency or a data office within some existing state agency that had the specific mission of developing a centralized data warehouse, producing standard reports and data tools for various audiences, and managing access to the data, and privacy and security concerns, of course. This structure would ensure that there's an entity responsible for getting this done, in collaboration with the segments and other participating agencies, of course, but a neutral entity with clear accountability that's not tied to a specific segment. The structure would also support expanding the data system to include data from private post-secondary, health, social services, early learning, or other agencies outside the public education systems, as you heard expressed a lot of interest in doing. So for decades, California has been sitting on a lot of education data with no publicly available information on the outcomes of its investments across public education. The state's well positioned now to join many other states in using data we already collect to create a comprehensive statewide system that can inform student decision-making, support schools and colleges in their efforts to improve student outcomes, and meet the governor's vision of using data to improve and align state education and workforce policies. I think we should seize that opportunity. I'm happy to provide you with some examples of how some other states have used their data systems.
Don't we need a central office to manage this operation, whether or not the data collection is centralized or whether it's federated?
I think you do, yes. You need a governance structure, whether you decide on a centralized data warehouse system or a federated system. I think you would still need a centralized governance mechanism.
Because somebody needs to do the collection, whether it's the initial collection or the collation, and then somebody needs to manage the output.
Yes.
As to what the product is that you're delivering and who you're delivering it to.
Yes, I can say as of the time I did the research that I wrote up in the reports of the states that had cross-sector data systems, more than twice as many chose to go with a centralized data warehouse rather than a federated system. A number of reasons for that, but most of them had to do with greater efficiency. They actually get used more because the data are already matched and already sitting together in a warehouse, making it much easier to access them. You heard people on the last panel talk about the lengthy MOU process, and every time they want to share data for a particular purpose, it's this long drawn out process of getting approval and MOUs and that kind of thing. So if you have a centralized data warehouse, obviously you need to have a structure as part of your governance where there's decisions that are made on how to use the data each time you're going to use it, but it's actually already there together, so that more other states than not have decided to go with that.
Well, my limited IT experience in California tells me when you're attempting to connect dissimilar systems, there are always connectivity issues, and that usually is very, very expensive to solve if you ever solve it. But
that's a bigger issue with a federated system than it is with it, yes.
Right. But, of course, one of the panelists, I think it was Dr. Brown, spoke about, there's certain data points, certain level of information that everybody would be interested in having, and then there's probably a significantly larger data set that would be unique to the UC or the CSU or the community college. So it's the centralized stuff that we need to get into a pot somewhere, either fed there or collected there initially, right? Mm-hmm. That's what we're talking about.
Yes. I certainly agree with her that there are, that each system office collects a subset of what the actual institutions have. Institutions have more data than they send up to their system offices. I think similarly, the system offices would probably have some pieces of information that wouldn't get sent up to any centralized data warehouse just because they weren't necessarily needed routinely to address questions, and so you could have sort of a mix of things, and some states have that, where they have a centralized data warehouse for a subset of pieces of information, and then if you want some other information, then you go out and you ask the systems to provide that. Or they have a centralized data warehouse for education data, but they have a federated system with, say, social services or criminal justice, where only if they need it do they go out and do a match and get records for the purpose they need.
I thought the cost information that was detailed in your report was sort of surprising. I thought it was rather low. I would have expected it to be much higher.
Well, I did not do an in-depth cost analysis, so I would caution you against that. What I did do is in all of my interviews, I asked people, national experts, people in other states, to give me estimates on what would it cost to do this. People just kind of routinely formed around I think it would cost California $2 or $3 million a year to have a system. Again, and I did a back of the envelope what did CPEC cost? Not that they did exactly the same thing as this, but, and it comes in if you inflate their costs to now somewhere in the $2 to $3 million range. But again, that would depend on how much you wanted to resource it. And that's just operating costs. That's not like the initial costs to pay, you know, all the systems to like be involved in figuring out what are we actually going to do here and what pieces of data are going to go in it and how do we develop our privacy and security protocols and all of that kind of stuff. That's an initial cost.
But it's an important, very, very important issue. I mean, I don't know how we measure and evaluate what we do across the board and at the end if we don't have data to permit the analysis to happen. So,
Right.
very interesting.